Good evening and a very warm welcome to this edition of Public Forum. I'm Shalini Verma. A mass protest is going on in the United States of America against the existing financial system and the practices of Wall Street, which is the financial district of the New York City. The protesters have varied causes and no apparent demands, but they share a common grudge against unemployment and economic inequality. So in this edition of Public Forum, we'll try to analyze the genesis and the impact of Occupy Wall Street protests. And my guests today are Mr. N. Madhavan, the Associate Editor with Hindustan Times, Ms. Jayashree Sengupta, Senior Fellow with Observer Research Foundation, and Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, Dean and Professor of Jindal School of International Affairs of Jindal Global University. But before we start the discussion, let us first take a look at this report.
A mass protest is going on in USA against the US financial system and Wall Street practices. The leaderless protest in the Wall Street section of New York has entered its third week, helping to inspire a growing number of demonstrations united in their passion for hitting the streets. The movement, which is modeled after social media-driven demonstrations in the Middle East, aims to raise awareness about the role financial institutions played in the economic downturn affecting the world markets and to show their discontent at the lukewarm attempts to prosecute those at fault. Demonstrators are also rallying against the state of the war in Afghanistan, the state of the environment, and the state of America and the world in general. In less than 3 weeks, the movement has become a magnet for countless disaffected Americans at a time when an overwhelming majority of US adults say the country is on the wrong track. Since then, the movement has spread to cities across the United States. Besides New York and Boston, protests have been held in Chicago, Los Angeles and Seattle. Bureau Report, Lok Sabha Television.
So the Occupy Wall Street protest is certainly making headlines not only in America but also in the entire world, and speaks a lot about the resentment, the frustration that people have, especially the 20-something that are now on the Wall Street demanding an action at least on unemployment and, of course, the financial system there. Certainly they are upset over a combination of factors. We hear news of Afghanistan war, environment, of course, the state of America's financial system, and a combination of factors, as I say. But is protest, at this point of time, do you think that this protest is really going to go very far? What is the kind of scenario that we see now?
I think we are at the beginning of a moment in American history that is irreversible. All the pent-up frustration which we just mentioned has now mushroomed to the point that this is going to be a standing movement. There's no way the protesters will melt away or just vanish. We've had two important moments of protest since the crash of 2008. There was one sitting at a factory in Chicago, 2008, and then the Wisconsin state legislature was occupied by unions earlier this year. Both of them dispersed because they were very, very limited in their targets. They were looking at some very specific local grievance about employer versus employer. It was the classic unions. But now you see the targets are varied. It can mean that the movement is very diffuse and doesn't have a single focus. But it can also mean that it is a catch-all movement and it has so many varied interests together that one or two might slip down the radar. But the agglomeration of grievances means that this is actually going to be a long-standing movement. I don't see it melting away even in the winter this year. And it's going to build up, as Mr. Madhavan said, until the election and possibly even later, because economic justice is the kind of issue that cannot be solved purely through electoral means.
But it has brought the nation, the attention of the entire nation as well as the world.
Absolutely.
On the middle class majority, would you like to say?
The entire majority, perhaps more so than the Anna Hazara movement in India, which is mostly middle class centric. This actually, the working class is fully involved in this in a bigger way, and I think this is actually a mass movement. The only parallel is of the Vietnam era movement of the 1970s. If you go back a little further in time, Roosevelt was pressured by unions and by workers and by working class to enact the New Deal in the 1930s. So, if at all it has an institutional denouement at the end, it has to involve Obama making significant concessions to the left in order to position himself on the side of this 99%.
Okay, what would you like to say about the methodology of this particular protest? Because right now we know that the trade unions have come out in full support of these youngsters. They come from a middle class background. Most of them are working class people. That's what is coming out in news. As well as we know of the kind of social networking sites and their usage has been there, whether it's Twitter or it's Facebook or whichever way, the message is being conveyed. More and more people are being attracted towards this. And as he's talking about the life of the protest, well, certainly these are the lifelines, one would say. Dr. Chaulia, what are your views?
This is Web 2.0 again, we've seen it time and again. In fact, there is an interesting parallel with the Red Shirts movement in Thailand. They had occupied and done sit-ins against the establishment last year and eventually achieved success in the form of changing the regime, which is now a pro-Thaksin regime, which is pro-working class. So the employment of new media tools is, it's almost becoming a cliche now. There's nothing unique in the sense that, protest is somehow being fueled by it. Rather, what is interesting is how did an individualistic society like the United States, where everyone draws inward and says, I lost my job, I have to pull myself up by my bootstraps. How did they come up with the idea of social action coming together in a way that has not been seen in 40 years? So history is, the wheel is turning.
Okay, so they started in a very unorganized manner, but right now they are also seeming very organized because we know that legal aid has been organized for them, medical aid has been lined up, and more or less they're also releasing their own newspapers because of the help that they're getting from different sections, including the trade unions. Well, in New York, we know of the Nurses Association, the Transit Union, the Transport Workers Union, who have now come out in full support of the Occupy Wall Street movement and are planning to join the protesters' meet. We know that this doesn't seem to be that organized in the beginning, but right now with these traders' union and their support, certainly a lot of developments are there on the Occupy Wall Street protest case. Okay, and let us now try and understand the reasons that we were talking about as to why this protest has started at all on Wall Street. One of the grave reasons that we talked about was the social inequalities in the financial system. Can you please elaborate a bit on this? How old is this and what are the...
It goes back to the Reagan Revolution. And basically after World War II, America had what was called the embedded liberalism, which was a model based on state intervention and some degree of social welfare provision that will mitigate the dark sides of excessive capitalism. But after 1980, when Reagan came out and said, government is not the solution, it's the problem, basically there was an assault on the state's welfare provision altogether. And you had the rise of what is called the neoliberal state. And under this was like a relentless march for accumulation, especially by Wall Street, big banks and investment firms and private equity firms. So the idea was to remove as many barriers as possible for their accumulation to happen, and which of course is deregulation. But then what it did was to also unleash the demonic side of the whole thing, where accumulation came at the cost of society. And there were social interests that were tread upon in the process. But there was a myth that kept this whole thing going, which was credit. Because of the cheap supply of credit, you had consumption rising, but actually real incomes of the 99% who are out now have stagnated since 1980. The statistics showing that actually you need to, for America to come out of this depression, they have to first actually raise the median wages, which they haven't in 30 years. But people still could consume and buy and, feel the retail therapy, factor in their lives because of credit. Now that it is dried up after 2008, people have suddenly realized that they have no credit card to, bank upon. And therefore, collective strength through mobilization and through grassroots coalitions. We've seen that during the Elect Obama movement, and many of these same participants who are today in Zuccotti Park in New York and other places are the ones who brought Obama to power. But in a way, they're disillusioned with the fact that, the system has seemed to have co-opted him. And I, tend to see this one of the messages, which is unheard of in the public slogans, is Obama, come back to us. We need you on our side to enact major change. That's what Roosevelt did in the 1930s when he was pushed by the people. So in that sense, this is a kind of like a maneuver in spatial terms, you have the big banks who always seem to have Congress and the president in their pockets. But the people are now asking the politicians, where do you stand? So it's a very critical position where they're inviting them to show their true colors. And those who are on the side of the fat cat bankers, as Obama called them, will inevitably be punished.
Now, the biggest problem right now is that some of the Democratic lawmakers have also proposed their support to these protesters. We know of the kind of political support at this juncture, let's say, to the movement. What would it really mean, Dr. Chaulia, according to you?
There will be factions within the parties who will now come out and, they'll be angling for, sympathy of the protesters and try to capitalize on it. In fact, if you look at the protest blogs themselves, the ones who are actually they're all worried about co-optation. And they're not only worried about co-optation by the parties, but even by the big unions, because it was spontaneous as we started the show. It was very spontaneous and leaderless, very much like, Jasmine Revolution in North Africa. And now the fear is that the organized interests will come in and then they have axes to grind and they will steer the direction of the protest in a certain way. And unlike, for example, Anna Hazare in India or Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand, there's no charismatic figure per se who's Michael Moore is around and he's blowing up the public, but he's not really a leader. So what this portends is that there could be an attempt at a takeover of this. And in fact, in many ways, Obama has already said in his remarks to try and steer it towards institutionalization. So he's been talking about consumer protection, right? I'm trying so hard for consumer protection. The people out there, I hear you, and the Republicans are blocking it, and therefore I need to go all out to override these concerns. So in many ways, he's also talking about how he needs the people behind his back to try and enact these institutional changes.
Maybe it's because of that the response to his speech and his remarks has been less than enthusiastic.